times. We're not live, are we?
We are indeed. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. I think people will continue to filter in as we go, but I think we've reached a critical mass, so we can get started. Thank you all for joining us to celebrate the North American release of Joseph O'Connor's incandescent new novel, Shadowplay. My name is Rachael Small. I am the Director of Publicity at Europa Editions. On behalf of all of my colleagues, I want to say how thrilled and humbled we are to be able to gather so many readers from all over North America and elsewhere in the world on a Thursday afternoon or evening or night for those in Europe. In the interest of building community, we'd love to hear where you're joining us from in the chat. You'll notice that you are muted, but please note that muted does not mean silenced. We invite you to share your questions with our illustrious authors and with each other in the chat throughout the event. We will open up an audience Q&A at the end. I want to take a moment to give particular thanks to our independent bookselling partners for this event. These are difficult days for all of us, and the independent bookstores that have long been the heart of our communities, that have provided consolation and safe haven to so many readers, are feeling the effects strongly, as we've seen them shift their business models in drastic and creative ways. We hope you will support these indie booksellers by ordering these great authors' books directly from them. And my colleagues will be sharing links in the chat throughout the event to help you do just that. Thank you so much to the Brookline Booksmith in Boston, Max Bax Books on Coventry in Cleveland, McNally Jackson Books in New York, Seminary Co-op Bookstore in Chicago, Skylight Books in Los Angeles, and Type Books in Toronto for helping make this event a reality. I now have the honor of introducing our speakers, two best-selling, award-winning, Dublin-born authors whose works span decades, continents, and genres. Their novels provide so much more than entertainment, though through their prose they have kept readers rapt. They also incite empathy and feats of imagination. Novelist, screenwriter, playwright, and broadcaster Joseph O'Connor was born in Dublin. He's the author of 9 novels, including Star of the Sea, a New York Times bestseller, and Ghostlight. Among his awards are the Prix Apeirogon for European Novel of the Year, France's Prix Mille Pages, Italy's Premio Acerbi, an American Library Association Award, and the Irish Pen Award for Outstanding Achievement in Literature. His work has been translated into 40 languages. In 2014, he was appointed Frank McCourt Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Limerick. He has been Harman Visiting Professor of Creative Writing at Baruch College, City University of New York, and Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library. He is an honorary ambassador of the Irish Writers Center, Dublin, and founder of the UL Frank McCourt Creative Writing Summer School at Glucksman Ireland House, NYU. O'Connor's most recent novel, Shadowplay, published in North America last month by Europa Editions, tells the story of Bram Stoker's years working as the manager of London's Lyceum Theatre, his tempestuous relationship with its owner, Henry Irving, and his lasting friendship with First Lady of the London Stage, Ellen Terry. Breathtakingly atmospheric, Shadowplay transports us to Victorian London, whose lamplit streets are being stalked by Jack the Ripper, and introduces us to a cast of vibrant, complicated, unconventional characters who feel utterly alive and contemporary. Shadowplay was named Irish Novel of the Year by the Irish Post Literary Awards and received rave reviews from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many others. For the Irish Independent Books of the Year, Colum McCann called Shadowplay one of the best books of the year anywhere. We are so honored to be joined today by the great Colum McCann, one of the world's foremost storytellers, the author of 7 novels and 3 collections of short stories. Born and raised in Dublin, Ireland, he has been the recipient of many international honors, including the National Book Award for Let the Great World Spin, the International Dublin Impact Prize, a Chevalier des Arts et Lettres from the French government, election to the Irish Arts Academy, the 2010 Best Foreign Novel Award in China, and an Oscar nomination. In 2017, he was elected to the American Academy of the Arts. His work has been published in over 40 languages, and he is the co-founder of the nonprofit global story exchange organization Narrative 4, and he teaches at the MFA program in Hunter College. He lives in New York with his wife, Allison, and their family. McCann's most recent novel, Apeirogon, I hope I pronounced that correctly, a New York Times bestseller, was published this past February to widespread critical acclaim. Based on the real-life friendship between two fathers on either side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Apeirogon is an ambitious, kaleidoscopic novel about personal and collective grief, art, nature, history, birds, politics, and humanity, and many other things. In her rave review for the New York Times, Julie Oringer called Apeirogon an empathy engine, utterly collapsing the gulf between teller and listener. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. And now I will pass the mic to Colum McCann and Joseph O'Connor.
Colum McCann, off you go.
Joe O'Connor, how the hell are you? Can you be entirely honest with me, Joe?
Yeah.
Can you lift up that cup?
Well, I have the cup, and then for later on in the party, I have this. So,
oh, okay. Now, can you tell me honestly what's in the cup?
The cup is tea. It honestly is.
Oh gosh, okay. But look,
that's the stage of life I'm at now, Colin. You know, if I have a drink, I can't work the next morning.
It's 9 o'clock in Ireland.
It's 9 o'clock in Ireland. The rain is pelting on the windows. It's July. You know, it's high summer. I'm freezing cold. And it's great to be with you all, and thank you everybody for coming along. I see a couple of people here who I know. I see some UL students who are very welcome, and it's nice to meet Rachael, of course, from Europa, and to have an opportunity to thank them for publishing the book as wonderfully as they have. And it's nice to see you, Colum, and to be able to thank you for being with us.
Listen,
and for doing this.
You know, people should know we've been friends for a long time. But you know, what's interesting to me is it goes all the way back, Joe, to the early 1990s, and I remember Cowboys and Indians coming out and kicking itself around on the bookshelves. That's a while ago now, and I just want to say about this novel. You know, when I take Ghostlight and when I take Star to Sea and when I take everything together, it feels that you were. First, I adore this novel, and it feels like you've been working many years to get to this particular place. This is one of my favorite novels of all time, let alone one of my favorite Joe O'Connor novels. And I think you've achieved something really spectacular that's going to last a long time, and I think everyone should know that from the get-go. So my kudos to you, and I really like to know where it came from for you.
In some ways, it came from my earliest childhood. Colum and myself both grew up in Dublin, where people do talk about writers quite a lot, but it tends to be the same ones. It tends to be the kind of pantheon, and they're all male, and they're all great, and they're all the people as well who were driven into exile. They hated Ireland so much that they had to go. But there are pubs named after Joyce and Beckett and Wilde, and we have bridges named after them, and buildings. And for some years when I was a kid, Yeats's face was on the currency. It was on the 5-punt note. But one of the writers who was never mentioned, one of the very many, was Bram Stoker. And the odd thing was, he was the first Dublin writer I ever heard of. My maternal grandmother, who was from Ferrybank in County Waterford, which is then quite a rural area, she came to Dublin. She married my granddad, and she had a great store of Irish rural ghost stories, and ghost stories from England. I remember her telling us about the Brown Lady of Rainham Hall, the first ghost who was ever photographed, she used to say. And there was a church in Dublin where it was said if you walked around it 3 times, the devil would appear. She was just a great storyteller. She loved supernatural tales. But the story of hers that I loved most was about an ancestor of hers, an uncle of hers by marriage, who had been a young man in Victorian Dublin. And he had had, if not the most beautiful job, but the most beautiful sounding job. He was a lamplighter. He was one of those men who went around lighting the gas lights every night. And she used to tell the story that one night he was on his rounds and he was outside St. Michan's Church on the North Quays of the Liffey, and it was a dark, foggy, atmospheric night, and standing outside the church on Church Street, the lamplighter noticed this well-dressed young man who seemed out of place because it was a very poor neighbourhood. The church was famous for some trick of archaeology whereby bodies buried in the crypt there in the medieval era had been preserved and still are to this day. Tourists to Dublin go and see the mummies in St. Michan's Church. Anyway, the lamplighter goes over, says to this very well-dressed young fella, are you lost? Are you out of place? And he says, no, he isn't. He's interested in the story. He's interested in the mummies in the crypt, and they get talking and they swap cigarettes. And the man says his name is Stoker, and he is a public servant. He works in Dublin Castle, and he does a bit of writing, in his spare time. So she used to tell us the story, and I just used to love the notion, even though I knew that this was exaggerated. I knew it was a tall story. I loved the notion that someone belonging to me, someone in my family, might have met Bram Stoker. And every couple of years, like I first heard the story when I was 5 or 6, every time she told it, she embellished it again and again and again, until finally it was as though, Bram Stoker had been invited round to her house for tea, and he felt like a kind of member of the family. So I just grew up being really intrigued by him for that reason. And then, as I say, we know so much about the other great Irish writers, and almost nothing about Bram. There was nothing named after him. There's a plaque on the house in Kildare Street where he lived, but he wasn't part of the consciousness. And the more I read about him, just the more fascinating I found his life, that he ran away from Ireland. He went to London. For most of his career, he worked in the theatre. He was a theatre manager of the Lyceum Theatre in the Strand in London, a theatre that's still very much there. And he worked with probably the greatest Shakespearean actor certainly of his time, and some actors say of all time, a man named Henry Irving. Spellbinding, magnetic presence on the stage. There are contemporary reviews that describe how he appeared to change shape, and people would boo and hiss and scream when he played Shakespearean villains. And they had a very tempestuous, very loving, very close, very argumentative friendship lasting 30 years that they both described as being like a marriage. And then the third person in this triangle, the great Ellen Terry, I suppose the first theatrical superstar. The British public just loved Ellen Terry. They would go to see her in anything. She was just so brilliant an artist, but also just very lovable. Everyone who ever met Ellen Terry seems to have fallen in love with her. So there's a brief period when these three great artists are working together and kind of living together in this theatre in the middle of foggy London. A very unusual, very ardent love going on between them. And I just felt that has to be a novel. So that's what the story of Ghostlight.
What you do in this novel is that you somehow tap into the music of all of these characters, whether it be Ellen or Henry or Stoker, and it seems to me that what you're doing is you're taking some of that anonymous or supposedly anonymous dust of history and then building it back up again. So as you say, we didn't really acknowledge Bram Stoker in Dublin. We haven't really acknowledged the full story where it comes from, but it's the job of literature to reinvigorate and resuscitate those sort of things. So it's almost as if you've gone into these little private corners and stirred up the dust, and out of the dust you've created this story that tells its slant in a certain way, but tells it deeply, deeply, deeply true at the same time. That's how I felt about it.
Well, isn't that what we do? I mean, that's what the job of the storyteller is. It is to kind of take the dust. It's to take the embers and fan them into a flame. And in a way, it's what the reader does as well. I mean, I think it's such a remarkable thing. I'm sorry, I've just realised I referred to the book as Ghostlight.
Yeah,
at the end of my last answer. Yeah. Another one of my lovely books. But this interview is about Shadowplay. When you think of the pleasure and the enlightenment and the knowledge and the empathy that has been brought to all of us, to everybody here in this virtual room tonight, by the written word. And when you look at what it is, it's black ink stains on a page, yet it's the most powerful virtual reality that has ever been invented. There's nothing more powerful than this, the journey that it can take you on into the heart and be experienced through the eyes of another person. And then in some sense, when that is done well, when that's done by a storyteller who knows what they're doing, the paradox is we return to ourselves with a greater sense of what it's like to be us. It's so magical. So I think of reading and writing really as being the same thing. I think what you and I do, Colum, and what the other writers, I see other writers here tonight, I see Marie Gethens there, and other novelists who are here, other short story writers. We write the sheet music, is how I think of it, and it's the reader who sings the song. So everything that we do should be to provide the reader with what they need to bring that story to life. And if it doesn't do that, if a book isn't written with the reader in that central place, I think it will fail. A novel is not there to demonstrate what you know about Bram Stoker, what you know about Victorian theatre, what you know about Rudolf Nureyev, the great novel dancer that you wrote, and the other stories that people have written here inspired by real people. The novel has to be about you. The novel has to have some resonance for the reader. So when you look at this story, Stoker, Irving, Ellen Terry, you say, well, it's not about those facts. It's about being young. It's about wanting to achieve something. It's about love, sexuality, friendship, loyalty, the desire that all artists have to write one book, to have one hit, to leave one thing behind you. Poor old Stoker, he spent most of his adult life, as I say, managing this theatre. He wrote in a part-time way 7 or 8 novels. None of them were successful. He working with these 2 megastars, he was like a footnote in history. And yet, we know that he's the one who went on to leave this epoch-making story in the world. So to me, it's a story of inspiration, a story of love, youth, learning to be yourself, learning to be at home in your own skin, and anything that it has to say about the sort of biographical facts of these lives is secondary to that.
Yeah, and that's beautifully put together, because what you're talking about is the novelist talking about the contents of the human heart. Sometimes there's a story there, but really what we're essentially talking about is the contents of the human heart. And what you do in this book is you get at the heart of loneliness, you get at the heart of desire, you get, but it's funny too, and it's ribald and it's cutting, but it's also profoundly philosophical and engaging too. But I have to ask you, were you not a little bit scared about like stepping off the cliff and going right, for Bram Stoker, there's a lot of academics out there who know a lot about what Dracula is and what Dracula means, about vampire literature, about Victorian England, about the theatre, about the Lyceum. You're stepping into pretty well-known territory. Of course, you reinvigorate it and you succeed enormously. But at the beginning, and if you can think back to the beginning, how scared were you in embarking on this one?
Well, writers have a funny mix, don't they, Colum? I mean, it is scary. I mean, every time you start a novel, it's scary. When a novel of mine comes out, you spend a year talking about it, and hopefully it's published in other countries. This one's being published here in the US. And you take a bit of time off writing. You step out of that kind of very deep, profound immersiveness, and you learn how to talk to people again. So I forget how to write every time. And then when I start again, it's petrifying. I look at my last book, I have no idea how I wrote that. I look at one of your books or Anne Enright's books or Peter Carey's books, the works of the writers I like, and I just go, geez, there's no point, But yet at the same time, if you're one of those people that has that desire to write, just to make sense of that, to kind of play with the English language and see what the possibilities are. If you don't give into it, you won't thrive. It's that simple. Some people want to be chefs, Some people want to play the piano, you know, and what I've always wanted to do is write books, and I'm glad that I gave into it. I'm glad that I've got better at it over the years. But yeah, of course it's scary. So you have to be sensitive to what you're doing, and you have to just not care. I mean, you have to have both of those things at the same time. You have to jump out of the plane and hope that what is on your back is a parachute and not a grand piano. And that's the job of the writer. And if that's not for you, then you need to do something else.
Or a parachute and a grand piano, so you can play the
parachute and a grand piano
on the way down. Actually, Kurt Vonnegut says we should be continually jumping off of cliffs and developing our wings on the way down, which is, you know, this notion of bravery and getting to the heart of it. But I want to know, what is the Joe O'Connor fascination with the sort of 19th century and the theatre? And, you know, how is it that you somehow make all of that pulse itself alive? I'm thinking of Star of the Sea, you know, I'm thinking of, you know, Ghostlight, which is later, of course, but, you know, all of those things. Where do you have any moment in your life that you can look to apart from the story you just told just a little earlier, that can clue us into how and why this is the stuff that fascinates your head and your heart?
Well, yeah, I mean, I love actors. I find them fascinating. To me, they're very complete artists. There's some actors here tonight. Kathy Rose O'Brien, my friend, is here, and some other actors. They work not just with the text, with the words, with the voice, with the body, with movement, with concentration. If they're stage actors, they do that at 8 o'clock every night, no matter what kind of day they've had. They do it on the last night of the run when there isn't going to be work next week. They just bring a totality of experience to their art that I really admire. And then what they do, the reason why we're attracted to it is that we're all doing it. I mean, Henry Irving, in one line in Shadowplay, says, everyone is acting all of the time. I mean, that's how we get through the day, isn't it? We can't actually say what we're thinking. As Bob Dylan says in It's All Right Ma, It's Only Bleeding, if my thought dreams could be seen, they'd probably stick my head in a guillotine. It's all right Ma, I'm only bleeding. So, you know, it's one of the ways that we get through life is we construct the self. And the self that we have with our kids is not the same as the self we have with our spouse, it's not the same as the self we have with our friends or with us. It's one of the wonderful things about us that we have a number of selves. I think, again, it's a great reason why we read, why we're drawn to fiction. There's a beautiful sentence in Joyce's Ulysses where he says, every life is in many days. Day after day, we walk through ourselves, meeting giants, robbers, ghosts, old men, young men, wives, widows, brothers in love, but always meeting ourselves. And that's why we have fiction, isn't it? Because the weight of being us is just a bit much sometimes. And we don't understand even what it's like to be us. And so we want to connect, we want to see what it's like to be somebody else. And to me, actors bring that to life more intensely and more purposefully, I suppose, than in some of the other arts. And they're also, it's so interesting to be backstage in any theatre, whether it's a 19th century Victorian theatre, whether it's theatre now. It's a place of dreams. I mean, it's so strange, like we're so familiar with it, but if you defamiliarize yourself from the theatre, if like when the Martians do come and they discover that like in every little town and every city in the United States and every town and city in Europe and all over the world, there's this building where these humans go and they sit there and the lights go out and people come on dressed up as other people and they tell stories about stuff that never happened and they pretend that it did and the people sitting in the dark pretend that it did, and then at the end, to express their approval, they bang their hands together and then they go home and in the car on the way they say, what do you think that was about? I mean, it's such a strange thing, such a strange world that actors move in. But as I say, I think acting and taking on roles is so much a part of life. And it's a very interesting thing about the Gothic Gothic literature, that there's often that notion of the other self. You know, Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the notion that in all of us there's one other. I think there's a lot more than one. If we could get it down to one, we'd be doing pretty well. But the epigraph of this book, if I can just read it, this is something that was written by the son of Ellen Terry, the central character in the novel. He wrote this in a biography of his mum. In every being who lives, there is a second self, very little known to anyone. You who read this have a real person hidden under your better known personality, and hardly anyone knows it. It's the best part of you, the most interesting, the most curious, the most heroic, and it explains that part of you that puzzles us. It is your secret self. So it's that secret self really is what the actor connects with as part of their art. So it's a wonderful thing.
I'm reminded of the Joyce line that you know, the function of literature is to recreate life out of life. You know, we live our lives and then you recreate life through literature, which is what you've done. And we're going to get you reading sometime fairly soon, and we're also going to get to the questions from everybody. So they're going to start populating the chat board there at the side. But talking about recreating life out of life, Joe. Simple, silly question. Who is the Dracula of our times?
Well, let me try and think. Is there somebody out there who would come to all of our minds who is a narcissistic, vampiric, a person who sucks up all of the energy around them, must have attention, yet oddly compelling? You know, many people find this person charismatic, despite the great evil that they're doing. So I'll have a think about that. And
yeah, I think we have to think. And then there are Bram Stokers everywhere, and people who are you know, like want to create these characters that to recreate life out of life. And you and I both teach you know, writing, and we're both involved in things that are active. We're activists on the ground in certain ways. We believe that literature and stories and storytelling can shift lives and shift perspectives in extraordinary ways. Can you tell us about your, you know, being there at the University of Limerick now, what it's meant to you for the past 5 years, I believe it is, to be teaching students, to be engaged with students, and to be working with organizations, including Narrative 4. Thank you for working with Narrative 4. Can you, you know, just talk a little bit about the writing life and how you encourage younger writers to get along?
Well, they're not always younger. I mean, one of the nice things about working at UL is they're new writers, but we've had people from the age of 20, we've accepted people who've just like not quite graduated, all the way up to, the student wouldn't mind me saying, a person who was 72, who brought an enormous amount to the group. And we try and actually balance our MA class in a number of ways, including age, every year. I mean, I've always taught, I love to teach. I have a notion that's probably insane that all practitioners should teach. I think it brings you back to the wellspring. You know, I think if you're a doctor, you should probably do some lecturing in medicine. I think if you're a plumber, you should probably have an apprentice. I just think otherwise you get too divorced from reality and too into your own thing. I get so much from teaching. I read stuff that I wouldn't have come across otherwise. I love being around the energy of the newer writers. I love having colleagues, I must say. You know, we've all been through the lockdown recently, and you know, one of the things that a writer has is a long training. You have this, Colin, and other writers here tonight have it. Sitting in a room by yourself, you know, we're pretty good at that. But at the same time, if you're at all a gregarious person, if you're at all somebody who likes the company of other people, that can be difficult. So, I mean, I love going to teach in UL. My wonderful colleagues, Sarah Moore Fitzgerald, Donal Ryan, the beautiful campus that we have, on the banks of the Shannon in County Limerick. And I loved the challenge, I suppose, of being the first chair of creative writing. The Frank McCourt chair, the job that I have, was established 6 years ago, and I was the first person to do it. So I mean, it's really irresistible. It's a lovely place to work, and I get so much from it. And may I say, they've also been extremely generous to me in terms of my writing career and time and so on. And Shadowplay would not have been written without the great understanding of the University of Limerick. So I want to thank them too.
I think a lot about Frank McCourt. I know Frank McCourt would have loved this novel. We're almost at the anniversary, actually, of his death. But at one stage, Frank said to me, he says, "Never let the truth get in the way of a good story." Right?
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting. You do shape the truth here, and you do take things and you compress things, but it's a textural truth that you're going for. So what I find with Shadowplay, why I find it so honest and profound, is that it feels entirely true. And I'm sure there's things that you've done that where you've manipulated the quote unquote facts. Sent them in mercenary directions. Can you talk a little bit about that, the relationship between fiction and non-fiction?
Sure. Well, I mean, to me, it doesn't matter that that Wuthering Heights isn't factual. I mean, to me, Wuthering Heights is true. There's more truth in Wuthering Heights or in Oliver Twist than there is in many works of Victorian non-fiction. So I think the job of the storyteller, I mean, the definition, if you like, the essence of what we're trying to do is to get at truth. But truth needn't be the facts. You just need to be very clear in the afterword of the book, as I am in the afterword of Shadowplay, that readers who are in search of the researched biographical facts need to go and look at these books, the ones that I used as part of my research. But what I have written is a fiction taking the facts as their starting point. And I feel it needs to be done with care. I think there's a bit of a license to do it when you're writing about a writer or an artist, because I think Bram sort of did this himself. I mean, even at the time, people said, hang on a sec, is Henry Irving the model for Dracula? There's a lovely moment in the middle of Dracula when Bram is looking for a kind of image of womanly beauty, and he includes the name of his great friend Ellen Terry. Someone is as beautiful as Ellen Terry. A really interesting thing for a storyteller to do. So he's aware of the real world. He's looking at the real world all the time. Dracula's crammed with sort of facts and modern inventions. There's telephones, sound recording, women's magazines, international travel. You know, we think of Dracula as a novel that's set in this funny kind of place over in Transylvania, but it's not. It's very much set in our world. So I think there's a license to do it once it's done with care and with affection and with the love that I have for the characters in Shadowplay. I mean, I really loved writing this book. It was a great pleasure to write this book. I loved spending time with Ellen Terry.
She's amazing.
Well, I mean, the sort of history of this with me is that I had a couple of goes at this story over the years in various genres. And it was always about the two guys. It was always a story of Bram and Henry. I wrote a television play based around them and a radio version of that. And they were grand, you know, they were fine, but I just thought there's something missing. Because we've seen that story. It's like The Odd Couple. It's Withnail and I. You know, there's a guy who's a bit eccentric and there's another guy who's very kind of pedantic and down to earth and he looks after him. And I just thought, I've seen this before. And I could probably date this. The morning that I sat down at the desk and I realized Ellen Terry shouldn't just be a character. She should be one of the narrators. I felt this electricity go through the book. And I just thought this book is now going to write itself. All I have to do is listen to the voice of this smart, funny, slightly anarchic, slightly disobedient, but very powerful woman. And the book is going to come to life. And that's really what happened. So, I mean, I would go down to work every morning in the office, wondering, you know, where is Ellen going to take us today, you know? And so I loved these three characters, and I really feel privileged to have spent time with them while I was writing Shadowplay.
I must say I love them too, but Ellen in particular, she took the oxygen out of the air for me.
She's a scene stealer, yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah, and funny and bawdy and on the book. You'd want to be able to sit down the pub and have an evening with someone like that.
Well, I find, with characters from, well, it's always, from the novel that I've finished most recently, but sometimes even characters from books before that, they never really go away. I mean, I ask myself some nights, what would Ellen Terry make of the pandemic, or how would Bram Stoker be voting in such and such an election, and what newspaper would Henry Irving be reading? I mean, your characters become very real to you because you know everything about them.
Yeah.
You know things about your characters that you don't know about your spouse. Because as I say, we sort of have fronts. We have masks, and that's how we get through the world.
Right.
But in order for the character to live on the page, the novelist has to know everything about them. You don't show everything. You might just show the kind of 5%, but you need to know the characters really intimately in order for the book to live at all. Yeah. And I feel I owe Ellen Terry, peace unto her spirit, an enormous amount, because she co-authored this novel with me.
That's a beautiful segue into passing it. I'm going to pass it back for a moment to Rachel, and we're going to ask you to evoke some of this novel for us. But hopefully I get a chance to chat with you before the hour is up. But can I say, Joe, it's so friggin' nice to see you, and it's so nice to launch this book in the United States. It was one of my favorite books. As I said at the very beginning, at the outset, it's one of my favorite books of all time, and I think you've done something really profound, and you pushed the limits, and yet you kept it within so many supposedly conventional narratives. To make things look simple nothing is actually simple, especially simplicity itself. And what you've done is pretty extraordinary. So I'm so happy that American readers get to celebrate this today. So go out and buy lots of copies for Christmas and for your friends' birthdays and all sorts of things. But I guarantee you they will love it.
Election day is coming up on the horizon.
We'll need something to distract ourselves.
Will I read a bit then?
Please do.
Okay, so I was talking about Ellen Terry, and I suppose how the book is structured is that every now and again, maybe 8 or times during the book, Ellen's own voice comes in. She interrupts the story, and she takes over, and she begins to speak in the first person about the events that you've just had described to you. So I'm just going to read a little bit from, I think this is the first time that you hear Ellen's voice. So you have to use your imaginations now. You have to imagine that I am an elderly, retired lady of the British Victorian stage. And I'm looking back fondly on the first time that I met the great Henry Irving, who, as I say, is a very magnetic, flirtatious, sexually charismatic, powerful actor. Everybody thinks he's wonderful, and this is what Ellen thinks. Do you know, I can never remember exactly when I met Harry. He was just always there, like the sky. We did Romeo and Juliet, I seem to recall, in Cirencester or somewhere, when I was 19 or 20. He was kindly, shatteringly handsome, and he had a sort of softness towards the older actors, which I always found touching. Spoke to them with great respect and good fellowship, even though some were long past their best nights, which in honesty might not have been all that starlit to begin with. Journeymen actors, may God bless every one of them, but he would take them out walking the morning after a show, sit with them a while in the park, make a little fuss of them, listen to their stories of the profession. He'd be careful to address them as sir or ma'am. Those small things count with me. We'd bump into each other now and again afterwards in some awful digs in the provinces. He was amusing and charming. He had the good flirt's trick of making you feel you were the only person in the room, which, even when you know how the trick is done, is always fun to see done well. His party piece was a satirical impersonation of himself playing Lady Macbeth. Look at me, I don't take myself tremendously seriously, that type of man, which is always a sign that they do. Another tactic, the poor idiot, was that he would flatter your hair. Oh, your beautiful russet ringlets, Angel. Is russet the correct word? You see, he knew that every other chap in the room, if he flattered you at all, would burble on about your eyes, because that's what chaps did. So it was always your hair with Harry. That way, you were supposed to notice he was different from the rest, tremendously full of feeling and sensitivity and refinement. I saw him do it 500 times. Mr. Russet. It could be early in the morning. It might be after a first night party. You could be looking like the portrait in Dorian Gray's attic. It was still, darling, your beautiful hair. Oh, of course, he was in love with one, just ardently, immensely, and going to shoot himself if he couldn't have you, and in love with someone else 3 minutes later. By the time you'd boil an egg, he'd have pledged undying devotion elsewhere and be about to leap off London Bridge if rejected. One admired his energy. Keep whacking the golf balls. One of them's bound to go in. That sort of chap. A bit scattergun in his approach to wooing. It was simply the way with Harry, like waiting for sunrise. But once you made clear that you wouldn't be going to bed with him, he would look oddly relieved and calm down. And the matter once raised would not be revisited, I will say that for him. He didn't make a nuisance of himself. Funny old skeleton, never dull. There are men whom it is important not to take the slightest notice of when they're talking, if it's after 10 o'clock at night and they've had a glass of beer. Harry was one such mammal. Once he asked my sister to run away with him, to Rotterdam, I think it was. She said no, and he asked my brother. That was the most important thing to understand about Harry. Essentially what he wanted, darling, who wouldn't, was someone to run away with him to Rotterdam. It's what all of us want, isn't it? Of course, nobody gets it. Probably not even those misfortunates who are in Rotterdam already. One wonders where they want to run away to. But he'd grown up and taken on a bit of sensibleness. Is that a word? By the time he opened the Lyceum. What age? Oh, in his middle 30s, I should guess, darling. No one can see things too carefully in our profession. 36-ish, perhaps. Harry was 36 a long time. No, I wasn't there when Bram came, although, oddly, I often think I was. Somehow, he was always there, like that rainy light coming in the windows. He was a darling man, rather obsessive, exquisitely serious. He could be absent-minded, too, the sort of fellow who goes out in unmatched shoes. One used often to think he would have made a wonderful monk. He didn't at all seem the sort one would employ as a manager. Head in the clouds sort of chap. Not a clue about the things that really matter in a theatre, like money, tickets, and making sure the gutters have been cleared and someone sweeping the foyer, and the actors aren't poisoning each other. A little of that is all right. It keeps up morale. Too much of it, and the audience start noticing. But an ingenue can grow into a role, after all. I suppose Bram must have done. God knows how. That's the word for Ellen Terry. That's her.
Thank you so much. That was gorgeous.
Pleasure. I'd love to stay here all night and read the whole thing to you. But Colin has pointed out you can read it to yourself in this very beautiful and amazingly affordable edition.
Right. All
Courtesy
right.
of Europa Editions.
Yes. Well, I would like to open the floor now to the Q&A session. We've received a number of wonderful questions in the chat. If you have a question and you'd prefer to ask it yourself, feel free to use the raise hand function, and we can call on you as well. But I will start with a question from Amanda at Warwick's bookstore. I love that the writer's struggle is so prominent in this book. Stoker is battling both his work-life imbalance and what may be an actual haunting as he goes to his little attic space to write. Did you set out to paint the writer's plight in this way, or did it naturally evolve as you wrote these characters?
Well, in the book, Thanks very much for the question. The questioner has alluded to the fact that there's an attic room over the theatre, which Bram discovers. Nobody's been there for years. The stagehands are afraid to go there because they think it's haunted. So Bram goes up, and it's full of spider webs and bits of old props and masks and theatrical costumes. And he likes it. He likes the solitude, and he makes a little desk up there, and he goes to write. And see, I think that every single one of us has a Lyceum attic. I think every one of us has a place where we go, and there are bits of scenery from things that have happened to us in the past. And some of the things are nice, and we like to shine the lights on them, and some of them aren't, and we put those in the spider webs and in the shadows. But we have that attic, and we go there. Some people call it the soul, some people call it the animus, some people call it the personality, but we all have it. It's a definition of being human. Yeats says in a beautiful line that all poetry comes from the foul, ragged bone shop of the heart. And I think that we all have that, the kind of rubbish, the detritus of our lives. And yet we realize that is the story. You know, we edit our stories, we edit our memories, we put them into a kind of shape that we would like them to have. But they're far more messy and far more full of shadows and broken slates and rain coming in through the roof than we would like to think. And I think what Bram accidentally stumbled into is his soul, his creativity. And that's something that we all have. It's a physical embodiment in the book of something that's in all of our hearts and our heads.
Yeah. Elaine Doyle is raising her hand, so I'm going to unmute her and let her ask her question. Elaine?
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Joe, I just have a question, I suppose, in shaping the characters of the book and in writing the book. How did you feel the book shaped you afterwards, and what were your learnings about writing this particular book?
Well, I was very interested, as I always am, in the music of a book. I mean, I like when prose has musicality. You know, that might be an Irish thing, although you see it in the American tradition as well, and in the tradition of many literatures. I like when the prose is doing something more than telling the story. It has to do that. It has to convey character and scenery and emotion. But I was struck by just trying to make the words have a sound that would scene set. If I can just illustrate it, just something that a tiny little piece, a paragraph that I worked for like a day on. This is a scene very early on in the book. Bram Stoker is a young man in Dublin. He has a terrible job, a very dull life. He goes to the theatre. He's working for free as a theatre critic. And he goes to this crummy little theatre in Dublin where the crowd are tough. I mean, this is more like a punk rock gig than a theatre. It's the first time he ever sees Irving on the stage. And he turns around at one point and he looks at the audience, and this is what he sees. He says, punks, drunkards, the disgorged and disgusting, warted, thwarted vagabonds, rent boys in drag, mad women, bad women, gougers on the make, fakers, forgers, mudlarks, midgets, Bridgets on the game and rickety kitties, oozers, boozers, beaters, cheats, picklocks, urchins, soldiers on leave, poleaxed, goggle-eyed, poppy-eating trash, refugees from the freak shows and backstreet burlesques, and the smell, oh dear God, it buffets you like a gust, layers of fetid fetor and eyes water yellow, like the smoke from a train to purgatory. So you couldn't write the whole book as heightened as that because
no,
it's
too perfectly
rich. But it's to have these little moments, I guess, where the prose sings, and does things that are kind of more than meaning and more than scene setting. Just that the sound of the words brings you into the scene, and that's something that I really only started to think about, despite always having loved music. I only started to think about that when I was writing my novel Star of the Sea. About 15 years ago now, I started to realize I'd been missing a trick in some of the earlier books. That just the sound, like words are sounds before they're anything else, as we all remember from our infancy. Childhood rhymes, nursery rhymes, just the sound of them is so consoling or frightening, capable of bringing us to a certain place.
Mm-hmm.
So with this book, I really tried hard to find the music of Shadowplay as I'm going along. Yeah.
That's interesting, very Dickensian, and even if you didn't understand the words, you have a sense, you know, at the end of it.
One of the tests that I have, and as I say, you couldn't do it in every scene, but I always have a few scenes in my novel where I imagine that I'm giving a reading in a country where I don't speak the language and they don't speak mine. So say it's Germany.
Yeah.
And that I'm reading, and that the audience would have some sense of what's going on just from the sound of the words before they get it translated. So the percussive kind of chunkiness of those words would conjure up something of what it feels like to be in that room, that theatre.
Thank you. So I have a question here for both Colum and Joseph. The two of you have written about artists, historical figures, for example, Nureyev, Synge, Stoker. Have you ever compared or discussed your writing processes when it comes to portraying such characters? Do you feel like your approaches are similar or rather different?
Well, Colum and I, you know, we know each other a long time. We've discussed work often. I think probably in broader ways than that. I mean, I don't remember sitting down and discussing, you know, individual novels with each other. But I mean, it's one of the nice things about the Irish literary scene, I suppose, is that it is collegial. It is supportive. Colum has been very supportive to me and to many writers over the years, and I hope that I have too. So we have discussed work, we've discussed football, we've discussed the Boomtown Rats. You know, we've discussed lots of things, and literature is just one of them, a very important one. But one of them. But no, I don't think I ever said so. Colum, I'm writing this book about the famine. It's called Star of the Sea. I don't think we've done that.
No, I mean, for me, the great surprise is that Joe's one of those writers, kind of like Michael Ondaatje and you know, Anne Enright and you know, there are others too, Peter Carey, people I think about that constantly surprise me. You know, I never know what the hell he's going to do next, and I kind of love that sort of being thrown off balance. Yeah, I think about Ondaatje. And you have no idea what he's going to do next. But I know for a fact that I'd walk 100 miles. I'd actually walk 500 miles for a new Michael Ondaatje book. Same thing with Joe. I've always felt that way about what he's been doing. So you know, there's no settling in there, and we don't swap notes. But I did sit down and talk with him about Apeirogon, my new novel, down in Queens in the pub, and I believe Queens is closing down this month. Joe, down in Dalkey, is that right?
It is, yeah, it is. It's a shame because I was gonna invite everybody back there after this. You know, I thought we'd all go to Queens and Dalkey for a few drinks
and be socially.
I guess we'll have to go somewhere on the Lower East Side instead.
Yeah, you know, the nice thing is that we are very collegial. We sort of do look after one another. I think a lot of this works because artists nowadays are working from a reckless inner need. You know, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, there wasn't, you know, the artist was more public and their statements were more public. And now you're working from this inner recklessness. So we associate, we look at one another and we know what sort of gambles we're taking. I know what sort of gambles Joe took with doing this book. And I know that I'm in total awe of how he achieved it and carved it out and made it sort of look simple. We sort of look to each other in that sort of direction rather than looking to each other for, you know, inspiration or, you know, advice or anything like that.
Wonderful. We've had a few questions about your writing process and practice, including from a former student of yours, Joe, from the UL Creative Writing Summer School, Maya. She said, how many hours in a day do you dedicate to writing, and how many months does it take you to write a book?
Oh God, it takes me ages. It takes me bloody years. I mean, my wonderful UL colleague, Donal Ryan, who for me is just, you know, the finest, the most consistently excellent Irish novelist of that generation. I mean, I turned my back. I go on a sort of long weekend away from UL, and Dono has written another brilliant prize-winning novel, his new novel, which is about to come out, Strange Flowers. It's just sensational. And I don't know how he did this, because he's a very hard-working teacher. So he writes very quickly, and he has that energy, I guess. It takes me 3 or 4 years. I write a lot at the beginning. I try to write, I would like to think it was 5 or 6 hours a day at the beginning, just for kind of draft zero, just to sort of splash something down on the page. And then I work in more focused, purposeful chunks of 90 minutes or a couple of hours, particularly since I have been teaching at university. And then at the very end, it goes nuts, and I stay up all night if I need to. So that's the kind of shape. But, you know, I think all writers like to think retrospectively that there's a logic to how they work. But the fact is, you know, some days it's great and then kind of 2,000 words flows out, and then other days it's like pulling teeth. It's just the most appalling way to be spending your time. But then you look back on it once it's published and done, and then you figure out, you know, what the book is about and how you wrote it, and then it's out in the world.
My next book is called Everything Joe Said.
Wonderful. We've gotten a question from Sheila from the Walter Scott Prize. She said, where did the marvelous character Bram Stoker's wonderfully awful boss in Dublin Castle, Mr. Meats, come from?
Yeah, I don't know. Poor old Bram, as a young man, he works as a legal clerk in Dublin Castle, as his father had done. The official title was Clerk of Petty Sessions, and he was so good at being a clerk of petty sessions, because Bram was a very assiduous, attentive person and quite professional, that after he moved to London, his former bosses in Dublin Castle prevailed upon him to write a textbook about how you did this job. So Bram Stoker's first ever published work was called The Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions. And as he wrote in a postcard to his son, it is every bit as enthralling as it sounds. But I don't know where his boss, Mr. Meats, came from. Yeah, I don't know. I made him up.
Invention. We've also gotten a question about the way that you weave Jack the Ripper material into the novel, which Martina says adds to the sense of time and place. Did Stoker mention the murders in letters or diary entries that you came across?
Here's the interesting thing, because I thought, okay, there is an attentive, world-aware man like Bram Stoker living in London during this period of 18 months or 2 years where these horrendous murders are happening. He must have noticed. He must have read about it. Perhaps it is part of the mix of the background of Dracula. It's interesting, the language that's used about the Ripper, that he goes about London at will, that he appears to be able to make himself invisible, that there might be more than one, that he's concealing secrets, that he's actually an aristocrat. It's the language that kind of seeps into the texture of Dracula, or so it seemed to me. So I guessed, I sort of thought it must be the case. Then the book came out. And after the book came out, I was doing a bit of research about something else. And I came across, of all things, Bram Stoker's introduction to the Icelandic translation of Dracula, in which he writes quite openly about the fact that the Ripper murders were going on at the time, and that they were part of the background texture for the book. So it was a guess that I happened to get right. I'm sure there are others that I got very wrong.
That you got the texture right. We've had a number of questions about what you're reading, you and Colum.
Oh, you can go first, Colum.
What have I been reading? Well, I'm trying. The interesting thing is that I'm trying to embark on a new novel, and I'm not sure what to write about right now. I'm kind of confused. I actually like those words. You know, I don't know. Joe was talking earlier about the multitudinous aspects of character and story and so on. And I'm thinking back to, Walt Whitman and Leaves of Grass, which is something which I'm reading right now. And I know Leaves of Grass, actually Walt Whitman comes up in Shadowplay in the most glorious way. Yeah. It's, it reminded me, rereading Leaves of Grass, and my favorite lines being, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. One of the things that's interesting to me right now is the multitudinous aspect of our character, not just, in Ireland or in the United States, but everywhere. And I do feel that we're being infantilized in all sorts of ways. Everyone's been asked to come into a room, to sit and to be boxed down into a particular idea. I think we're so much more nuanced than that. I think we're so much more messy than that, as Joe would say. And I like the idea of us being messy. So I'm going back to big poetry. I'm going back to some ancient texts. And every now and then I come upon a whole crop of new, younger, in particular Irish writers, in particular women, Irish women writers, who are doing extraordinary things. I'm not going to start listing them because I'm going to leave somebody out, but there's some really rocking things happening in young, sort of like 20, 30 something Irish literature, which is really fantastic. It's really sort of, Joe and I both came in curiously at a time when it was hard to get published as an Irish writer. He sort of broke the mold in many ways. And Roddy and people like that came along. It was very difficult just before we came along, in the 1970s, 1980s, it was difficult for a younger Irish writer to get published. In the 1990s, when we started, we got a few breaks. We were lucky. And there's some interesting things happening now in young Irish literature that hopefully we paved a certain amount of the way for, but they're also paving the way for us to come backwards.
Yeah, I'm trying to get going in a novel at the moment, and so I don't really read much fiction when I'm at that stage. The novel is set in Rome during the Second World War, so I'm reading a lot about Rome. And for pleasure and enlightenment, I'm reading a lot of poetry. So we lost the great Evan Boland, passed away a couple of months ago, and I have been just systematically reading all of her work. I want to read all of Evan Boland over the course of this year, just as a way of saying goodbye to her. I never met her, loved her work from a distance, but never got to shake her hand. And I wish that I had, because I'm just struck day after day by the great power and beauty and insight and hidden stories that are contained in her poems. I've just finished a really breathtaking book. I've never read anything quite like this. It's called A Ghost in the Throat, and it's a non-fiction work by the Irish poet Darren Ní Ghríofa. And it's really about her relationship with a particular poem. There's an old Irish poem called The Lament for Art O'Leary. It's written in the voice of a woman lamenting her lover who's been killed by the British forces. He bought a beautiful white horse in disobedience of the laws that have been imposed on the country, and he's been killed as a result. And there's this beautiful long lament, one of the classic kind of works of old Irish literature. And this book, A Ghost in the Throat, is about Darren Ní Ghríofa's relationship with this poem and how it changes from reading it as a young woman, reading it as a mother, thinking about versions of it, thinking about images in it. And I suppose it's just a great tribute to the thing that all of us here would recognize, the love that we have for the written word and how it touches us and how it stays with us through life, and how in some sense, the hallmark of a great piece of literature is that it's slightly different when you read it at the next stage of your life. I feel like that about, The Catcher in the Rye, which I first read when I was 17, and you love it, its kind of cheekiness, and you love its irreverence when you're that age. It's so funny. You've never come across anybody with the voice like Holden Caulfield. And when you read it as a parent, you see the other colours in it, and the darkness and the loneliness of it. And I assume when you read it as an old person, you see other things again. So Derony Grief's book, which I don't know if it's available yet in the United States, it's just a beautiful book about that, about the joy and the sustenance of reading. So those are some of the things that I've loved recently.
Thank you so much. I know I could listen to this conversation for hours and hours more, but
we're only getting started.
Reached the end of our time. I want to thank Colum McCann and Joseph O'Connor for joining us today. I want to thank our bookstore partners, Type Books and Skylight Books, the Brookline Booksmith, the Seminary Co-op. I'm leaving somebody out and I am so sorry. It's in the chat, for spending this afternoon, evening with us. Please go out and buy Apeirogon and Shadowplay and Let the Great World Spin and Ghostlight and all of these authors' fantastic novels from your independent booksellers. And thank you again.
Joe O'Connor, beautiful job. Cheers.
Cheers, Colum. Lovely to see you. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming along.
Yeah, thank you to everybody. That was kind of wonderful.
So I'll see you down at Swift's in the East Village then in 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'll see you in a few minutes.
Let's all go dancing.
Yeah, let's do it. Listen,
right.
thank you to everybody for coming along. That was amazing. That was an amazing chat. Thank you.
Thanks very much. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.